On the outer rim of Red River, Tennessee, past the line where the dirt roads stopped pretending to be paths, stood a house that refused to sit straight. Built in 1812 by settlers with trembling hands and mismatched tools, the Bell family farmhouse leaned in ways no structure should. Its roof sagged in one direction, its windows refused symmetry, and the foundation seemed to breathe with the earth beneath it, rising ever so slightly during storms, sinking again under sun. Locals called it the Crooked House, though not in jest. Even children who knew nothing of fear would go quiet when they passed it on horseback, eyes fixed on the twisted chimney that never seemed to smoke, even in winter. The air near it was always colder. Birds never perched on the fence posts, and no matter how hard a person shouted within earshot, sound had a way of dying just before reaching the front steps. It stood alone on Hollow Hill, where the mist came early and stayed late. Trees surrounding it looked older than the forest itself, branches brittle, bark peeling like dead skin, roots exposed and clawing at the soil like they were trying to escape. Nothing bloomed on that hill, no matter the season. Even weeds grew sideways, as if leaning away from the house. At its base, the land rolled downward into a shallow basin where mud never dried and prints left by hooves or boots never filled in. Some believed the ground there had memory, a kind that kept imprints not just of feet, but of sin. People in Red River spoke little of the Bell family, not from malice but from practiced discomfort, like one might avoid talking about the family of a child who wandered into a well. They were not seen often in town, not invited to church, and never questioned when they remained behind during communal gatherings. It wasn't that the Bells were feared outright, it was worse than that. They were forgotten on purpose. People felt lighter when they pretended the house wasn't there, even though everyone knew it was. In time, it became part of the land's background noise, like the creak of branches or the rustle of leaves that sounded like whispers even when no wind blew. Inside that house, strange rhythms ruled. Lights flickered at precise intervals, even though no one knew how they were powered. Wooden floorboards groaned at night, but never under footsteps. Sometimes neighbors passing by claimed they heard a piano being played, notes soft, off-key, repeating the same 3 chords over and over, never resolving. And yet the house had no piano. When questioned, the Bell matriarch would smile gently and say, "That sound's been in the walls longer than we have." She always spoke in past tense. It is said that every house remembers its dead, but the Crooked House on Hollow Hill did more than remember. It was absorbed. It was held. And deep within its foundation, in the part of the earth no shovel ever dared touch, something had been waiting. Not screaming, not clawing, just waiting, quiet as breath. As the decades unfolded and the world outside moved on, the house stayed frozen. Suspended in rot, in ritual, in a silence too dense to break. And when the blood finally surfaced, when bones pressed up from shallow graves like hands reaching for the moon, it would be too late to ask why no one ever listened to the quiet. The storm that rolled across Hollow Hill the night Hiram Bell was born was one of those mean Tennessee tempests that seemed to come from nowhere, all wind and no warning. Trees bowed like grieving men, and lightning lit up the Bell farmhouse in fractured flashes, revealing crooked windows and slanted beams that looked worse in that stuttered light. Inside, the walls were swollen with heat and the smell of blood and afterbirth. The local midwife, Mary Tolliver, had delivered dozens of babies in her time, through floods, fevers, even war. But she would remember this one until the day she died. Not because of complications, not because of screams, but because there were none. The mother labored in silence, her face eerily blank as she pushed, and when the child came, slick and warm and motionless, the room felt colder than the storm outside. Hiram didn't cry, didn't kick, didn't gasp. He opened his eyes slowly, as if he'd just awakened from a long sleep, and stared up at Mary with a stillness that didn't belong to a newborn. She waited for a tremble, a twitch, anything. Instead, the boy simply watched her like he'd been here before, like he knew something she didn't. She wiped him off, wrapped him in linen, and waited again, for the cry that never came. It was the mother who finally broke the silence, whispering that it was all right, that he was a quiet soul. But Mary wasn't comforted. She swore later that when she touched the boy's hand, it felt wrong, not lifeless, but too steady, like holding something carved from damp stone. His skin was cold and dry, not soft like other infants. When she looked into his eyes, what she saw wasn't innocence or confusion. It was knowing. The kind of knowing that should never belong to someone who had just taken their first breath, as if he wasn't meeting the world for the first time, but returning to it. She left that night with her apron soaked and her faith shaken, muttering to herself that some children cry because they're afraid of the world, and some don't cry because they already understand it. In the weeks that followed, neighbors brought pies and blankets, as they did with every birth. The Bell family smiled politely, and baby Hiram remained a quiet bundle swaddled in white. He never fussed, never startled, never wept. His mother claimed he slept through the night from the start. But Mary Tolliver, who refused to return to the house again, told anyone who would listen, then no one at all, that the baby had not blinked once during the entire birth. Not even when the lamp shattered, not even when the thunder cracked so loud it made the floor groan. She said the boy didn't act like a newborn. He acted like he was studying, observing, remembering. And when someone finally asked her what she meant, she only said this, that something else had come through with him. Something too calm, too ready. She never went near Hollow Hill again. The woods behind Hollow Hill were thick and overgrown, a patch of land too stubborn for plows and too hushed for logging. Locals said the trees grew too close together, as if leaning in to listen. In the fall of 1846, two hunters chasing a wounded fox stumbled into a thicket where the ground had split from recent rain. What they found made them forget the fox entirely. A skeletal figure lay half submerged in the mud, its ribcage exposed like a peeled open fruit, spine arched unnaturally forward, and 13 rusted nails driven into its lower vertebrae, each one spaced exactly 2 finger widths apart. The left hand was gone, cleanly severed at the wrist. The hunters ran back to town, breathless, unable to explain what chilled them more, the mutilation, or the way the corpse seemed almost posed like it had been laid there to say something no one could yet read. When the sheriff came, he took one look at the twisted remains and shrugged. Likely a runaway, he said, or a drifter who met some wild animal. He ordered the body buried quickly and quietly. No one dug deeper, but on Hollow Hill, Hiram Bell was already digging. In a locked room beneath the creaking boards of the farmhouse, Hiram kept careful notes, his handwriting thin and sharp, like bone splinters pressed into paper. He wasn't interested in names. The body in the woods had belonged to a man with a scar across his jaw and teeth stained black from chewing bark. But Hiram hadn't written that down. What he'd written was that the human spinal column could tolerate 13 direct punctures before motor control failed. That pain, when introduced slowly to nerve clusters along the sacrum, caused a distinct expression, mouth open, eyes unfocused, tongue trembling slightly. He had watched it happen, not with fear, with wonder. The missing hand wasn't discarded. It was hanging from a hook in the cellar, dried and curled like a dead spider. He was testing the limits of decomposition, wrapping it in soaked cloths, then scraping it raw, trying to see which tendons decayed last. It was all a kind of language to him. Pain was just the body's way of confessing its design. No one suspected him. Hiram Bell was quiet, polite, even gentle in town. He read scripture aloud for the blind, carried flour for elderly widows, and built birdhouses for the schoolhouse children. But inside his head, everything was a mechanism. The body was a blueprint God had never finished, and Hiram had taken it upon himself to complete the work. He didn't see cruelty in what he did. He saw order. The body in the woods had simply been a sample, a test, a step toward what he would later call clarity. And though the sheriff buried the bones under unmarked soil, Hiram kept the memory preserved in jars. Behind the cellar wall, lined in shelves, were glass containers filled with nerve threads, tooth fragments, small folded pages soaked in fat. The 13th nail, the one that hit the exact point where sensation collapsed into silence, was set aside. He believed it held something sacred, not magic, not madness, just the perfect proof that pain could be measured. The room beneath the Bell farmhouse was not part of the original blueprint. It had been carved slowly into the earth by Hiram's own hands, hidden behind a false stone wall and accessible only through a narrow chute disguised beneath an old coal stove. The air inside was always damp, thick with the sourness of mildew and something else, something more metallic, more alive. The walls were packed with earth but lined with salvaged planks, each bearing stains that didn't wash out, no matter how many times he scrubbed. On one side stood a table, not meant for eating but for fastening. Above it hung ropes that were frayed where they had burned through flesh. And in the far corner, wrapped in oiled cloth to protect against mold, was the ledger, bound in animal hide, with thick yellow pages that curled at the corners. Inside there were no names, no dates, just numbers, arrows, drawings, and words that read more like music notation than language. Hiram had come to believe that the scream was a form of communication older than words, older even than thought. It was the body speaking in its truest voice, stripped of pride, of planning, of self. Each scream, he wrote, had its own fingerprint, some pitched high and fast like birds in a storm, others low and wet like something drowning in its own blood. But he wasn't studying them as sounds. He was studying what made them stop. How long could the throat endure before tearing? What angle of the jaw produced the cleanest resonance? Which muscle gave out first when panic set in? The diaphragm, the tongue, or the will to survive? He tested it all, and he took notes. Not out of cruelty, he believed, but because no one else had dared to measure something so human. He did not kill in anger. He was killed in observation. In the ledger, he marked a symbol that looked like a curled feather for screams interrupted by sobbing. A different one, 3 dots in a triangle, for those cut off by choking. Pages were filled with sketches of mouths, some wide open, others puckered in agony, their teeth detailed with delicate shading. Underneath each drawing, he wrote how long the scream lasted, what tool had been used, and what he believed it revealed about the subject's inner pitch. That was what he called it, the soul's hidden sound. If someone screamed in perfect thirds before breaking, he said their soul was ordered. If they made no sound at all, he called it an inverted void and kept a piece of their tongue preserved in salt. Over time, the basement became not a chamber of horror, but a lab. A place where Hiram collected pieces of sound the way others collected coins. He built strange devices, too. Simple wooden boxes that clamped the jaw open, funnels that amplified breath, stringed instruments strung with vocal cords. Nothing ever felt complete to him. Every experiment led to another deeper question. Upstairs, he remained the same soft-spoken man who brought pies to funerals and read aloud at church for those with poor sight. But beneath him, below his feet, human pain was being studied like scripture. Screams were not cries for help, they were hymns, and he was the only one who knew the words. He began to believe that through enough study he could write a kind of symphony. One final composition that captured every kind of scream, every kind of break, not for an audience, not for pleasure, but to prove that suffering had shape, and that shape could be known. The ledger grew thick. The room beneath the farmhouse grew quieter. His hands grew steadier. And above all, his obsession deepened. Not with the killing itself, but with what it uncovered. What lived inside the silence after the last sound faded. Tucked behind a false panel in an upstairs cupboard, hidden beneath layers of decaying linens that no one touched for years, was a book that didn't belong to Tennessee. It was older than the farmhouse, older than the nation itself, its leather cover eaten away at the edges and sealed with a metal clasp, rusted shut from blood or time. No one could say which. Hiram had found it when he was 14 during a thunderstorm that rattled the chimney stones loose. The panel popped open from the shaking, and what slid into his hands didn't feel like discovery. It felt like delivery. The pages inside were written in Latin, thick ink pressed deep into parchment that smelled like rot. They weren't stories or sermons. They were instructions, detailed, measured, patient instructions, diagrams of the body not for healing but for breaking. Charts of grief translated into physical pain. Rituals marked not by moon phases but by the cycle of mourning. The first day of weeping, the 7th of rage, the 40th of silence. The book was unsigned, but Hiram knew it was family. The handwriting matched the old bell letters stored in his father's desk. The margins were filled with English notes added later, translations made by someone who had also walked these Tennessee hills, someone who had understood that the book was not just history. It was inheritance. The journal belonged to one of his ancestors, a plague doctor who had worked in silence while villages collapsed around him. But unlike others, he had not worn the mask for protection. He wore it to separate himself, to become something else, something that could do what must be done. The journal described not treatments but trials, subjects made to endure extremes not in the name of cure but clarity. The idea was simple, that pain, when shaped correctly, could burn away grief, guilt, sin, even memory. It was not cruelty, it was cleansing. They called it Divina Sectio, the divine cut. And for generations, the Bell family had hidden this doctrine beneath layers of church-going smiles and quiet farm life. Hiram was not inventing horror. He was continuing it. In the back pages of the journal, pressed flat with dried herbs that had long since lost their smell, was a hand-drawn seal. 4 circles inside a square, each marked with a Latin phrase that roughly translated to, "Sorrow must be emptied through the wound." Hiram traced that seal onto his basement wall. He began using the journal's rituals not just to study pain, but to shape it. One entry instructed the practitioner to press a red-hot iron near the base of the skull exactly 13 seconds after the subject had confessed a sin aloud. Another detailed how to fasten a mirror above the victim's face during the final minutes of life, so their last expression could be seen, and it claimed, absorbed. These weren't just acts of violence. They were performances, and Hiram followed them not as a madman but as a pupil. He believed the original writer had opened a doorway through agony, and that each proper ritual brought him one step closer to it. He began speaking aloud as he worked, not to the victims but to the air itself, as if reading his acts back to the ones who came before. He felt their approval in the silence, a stillness that made the flames in the lamps bend low, that made the insects outside stop their sound. In that silence, Hiram was not alone. He was the air, the final hand in a long chain of cold hands. The orchard behind the Bell farmhouse had always looked out of place. The trees were too close together, their trunks knotted and bulging, branches twisted as if straining to lift something heavy. The apples they bore were pale, almost waxy, with a strange metallic aftertaste that no one could quite explain. Children who ate them sometimes fell sick. Animals avoided the trees entirely, and more than once a neighbor swore they'd seen crows land on the branches only to fly off shrieking a second later. Still, the Bell family insisted the orchard was blessed soil, and Hiram often gifted jars of jam to town elders who never questioned the source. But in the spring of 1849, during a storm that cracked the sky like a splitting bone, something rose up from the dirt. After hours of rain, red liquid began to leak from the bases of the trees, not thick like sap, not bright like wine, but a deep, muddy crimson that soaked through the roots and bled into the surrounding grass. One tree oozed from a split in its trunk, the stain traveling down like a wound reopened. By morning, the orchard smelled like copper and rot. Townsfolk said it was a curse, that the land had been claimed by something old and angry. Some blamed the Indian spirits they believed had been buried there long ago. Others whispered about the devil's tithe, pointing out that the Bell farm never failed during drought, never lost animals to sickness, never missed a harvest. But none of them knew the truth. The red was not from the trees, it was coming from beneath them. The orchard had been planted over Hiram's first burial site, not a graveyard, a pit, a wet, sunken place where the soil had given way after he'd tried to dig too deep too fast. Back then, he hadn't perfected the art of spacing. Bodies had been stacked too close together, their fluids mixing, bones breaking beneath the weight of the others. Over time, the decomposition had turned the earth into something different, thicker, heavier, hungrier. The roots of the apple trees had grown down into this stew of decay, feeding on marrow and soft tissue, pulling minerals from skull fragments and rusted nails. What bloomed from those trees wasn't fruit. It was a slow harvest of everything buried there. Hiram had known the orchard would eventually give something back. That was part of the design. Pain, he believed, was not meant to vanish, it was meant to settle, and from that settling came a kind of spiritual bloom. The trees were part of the ritual, a living veil between the upper world and what he called the hollow beneath. When the red liquid surfaced, he did not panic. He stood barefoot among the trunks that night, letting the runoff touch his skin. He said it was proof the veil was thinning, that the bodies beneath were beginning to speak. When others saw the orchard bleeding, they stayed away. But Hiram began sleeping closer to it. Some nights he laid his head at the base of the oldest tree and listened for movement underground. The land wasn't cursed, it was communicating. And what it whispered to him through the roots would soon lead to even deeper rituals. Ones that no rain could wash away. The drought of 1850 emptied creeks across the county, exposing what the land had hidden for decades. One such creek curved along the edge of Hollow Hill, where the water had always run murky and sluggish, as if weighed down by something no eye could see. When the sun dried it to a cracked bed of dirt and roots, the neighborhood children went down to play among the rocks, chasing frogs and skipping stones. That's when they found the fragments. At first, they thought it was just broken pottery. Dull brown pieces with jagged edges, some no bigger than a coin. But one child noticed something strange. A piece the size of a palm with the outline of an eye on it. Not drawn, molded, pressed from life. Nearby, they found more. Lips curled mid-scream, nostrils flared, a chin bearing what looked like a gash. As they pieced the shards together, they didn't see bowls or vases, they saw human expressions. Stuck in time, screaming into silence. The sheriff took the fragments and tossed them in a box. He said it was likely art from the Indians who'd once lived near the river. Maybe ceremonial, maybe old toys. But the eyes were too detailed. The mouths are too desperate. These were not crafted for beauty or worship. They were copied from pain. In truth, Hiram Bell had made them in his cellar, kneeling beside his victims with fists of wet clay. He didn't sculpt from imagination. He pressed. With hands calloused from digging and cutting, he pushed the clay against their faces while they cried, while they begged, while they died. He worked fast. He had to. The clay only took shape when the skin was warm, when the muscle beneath the cheekbones still trembled. It was about timing, about capture. He didn't want just their faces. He wanted the exact moment when pain and fear met understanding. The second they knew they wouldn't leave alive. That's what he believed was the truest shape of a human soul. Not peace, not joy, but the breaking point. The masks weren't trophies, they were studying. He arranged them on shelves, grouped by emotion, wide-mouthed terror, clenched jaw defiance, silent despair. Each one labeled in a secret code he had borrowed from the plague doctor's journal. The same alphabet of suffering written centuries before in a dead man's hand. In Hiram's mind, these faces were not what he had taken. They were what he had saved. Imprints of raw honesty. A kind of confession no priest could ever pull out of a man. Some he painted with a red pigment made from dried blood. Others he left plain, letting the cracks in the clay spread over time like veins. And when he was finished with the set, he buried them. Not out of shame, but because he believed clay must return to earth just as flesh returns to rot. The children who found the fragments never played near the creek again. One swore he saw a full face, eyes open, mouth wide, half submerged in the dirt before the rain came again and washed it deeper into the ground. None of the adults believed him. But that night he woke up screaming, claiming he'd heard someone whispering through the walls of his home. Words spoken through clenched teeth as if pushed through hardened mud. Hiram never mentioned the masks to anyone. He didn't need to. He believed the clay held memory. That someday, long after he was gone, the earth would reveal them again piece by piece, scream by scream. And those who touched them would feel exactly what he had felt. Complete stillness in the face of unfiltered human agony. At night, when the wind had settled and the sounds of insects gave way to silence, the Bell farmhouse spoke back. Not through creaks or floorboards or moaning pipes. It was more exact than that. From within the walls, a voice would rise soft and slow, as if slipping between the wooden beams like breath. Hiram often sat in the center of the parlor, hands folded neatly on his lap, eyes closed, head tilted slightly toward the plaster like he was listening to a lullaby. The voice belonged to his mother, or at least that's what he believed. She had died when he was a boy, and her passing had been quiet, too quiet. He remembered no final words, only the sound of her breath rattling thin in her throat, and then the sudden emptiness that followed. But in recent years, the voice has returned. It came in full sentences now, sometimes scolding, sometimes praising, always calm. It repeated things she had once said when he was small. Be still, Hiram. Watch closely, do not tremble. Sometimes it said things no living person ever had. But the voice may not have been a ghost. In his cellar, among the ledgers and jars and rusted hooks, Hiram kept something else, a box fitted with wire and a strange glass cylinder. He had found instructions for it in the back pages of the plague doctor's journal, beside sketches of organs and symbols scratched in mirror writing. The device captured sound, but only under specific conditions. It had to be placed near the dying. It had to be surrounded by silence. And it had to remain untouched until the breath stopped. Hiram had recorded screams, sobs, and prayers. And in the moment just before death, something else. A pattern, a frequency he believed was a soul breaking loose. When he replayed the recordings late at night, he heard whispers that sounded like her, like his mother shaping herself from the voices of the dead. Whether it was her spirit or simply madness didn't matter. The voice knew him. and when she spoke through the wall, she told him to continue. In the coldest corner of the cellar, beneath the beams that never stopped dripping and beside the wall marked with faded blood rings, Hiram kept one body alive, just one. The others had been taken quickly in controlled trials, brief studies of sound and breath. But this one was different. The man was a preacher, well known in the Red River Valley for his sermons about devils wearing human skin and sin disguised as kindness. He had spoken once in the town square about unnatural things hiding in plain sight, about evil that smiles before it cuts. Hiram had stood in the crowd that day, quiet and still, hands folded behind his back, listening to each word as though being named. And when the preacher's voice wavered for just a moment, when he looked into Hiram's eyes and seemed to pause, it was then that Hiram decided to bring him home. Not as punishment, as proof. Proof that even a man of God could be opened up and studied like the rest. He fed the preacher warm broth, changed his bandages, kept the room just cool enough to slow infection, just warm enough to stop him from freezing. He called him the witness, not because the man had seen anything, but because Hiram believed the preacher carried something hidden inside him, something that only prolonged pain could bring to the surface. Over the course of 91 days, he mapped the preacher's reactions. Not to torture, but to time. The first week was silence, the second prayer, the third bargaining. Hiram recorded it all, mouth shapes, breath rates, the color of his eyes as tears dried into cracks. But he wasn't chasing pity, he was chasing a theory. That regret was a physical thing, that it lived somewhere behind the heart, maybe near the spine, and could only be exposed through suffering. Not sudden violence, but slow peeling. As if the soul had layers like bark. Each day Hiram worked in inches, a tendon teased from the wrist, a sliver of scalp removed and preserved in salt, skin peeled but never fully detached, stitched loosely back into place so he could revisit it later. And through it all, he spoke gently to the man, asking simple questions. Do you regret speaking out? Do you regret watching others suffer and doing nothing? What part of you regrets being born? He wasn't mocking. He was curious. He believed if the man could name the exact moment of regret, Hiram would see something shift. Some tremble in the bone, some ripple in the muscle that would mark where it lived. When the preacher finally stopped responding, Hiram carved open his chest, slow and reverent, and pressed a mirror inside, angled just beneath the ribs. He stared into it for hours, convinced that something would reflect back. Not an image, but a truth. Something dark and slow-moving. Something that explained why humans feared silence so much. Because in silence, regret grows teeth. When the body finally died, Hiram didn't bury it. He preserved it, posed in a kneeling position in the far corner of the cellar. Mouth slightly parted, one hand raised as if in prayer or surrender. He dressed it in a thin white robe and tied a red thread around the throat, his mark for subjects who had reached what he called the brink. For years afterward, he claimed the preacher still whispered at night, not through words, but through the sound of dripping. Measured, soft, steady. He believed the man's regret had not vanished with death. It had become part of the room. A warning, a companion. A sound only he could hear. On a night when the moon sat heavy and white over Hollow Hill, Hiram Bell finished what he had long believed was his life's true work. The orchard was quiet, the wind soft as breath, and the earth damp enough to yield without protest. 21 burial pits had already been carved into the soil over the years, scattered carefully around the property so no one place held too much weight. But this last body, the 22nd, would complete the pattern. Not a mass grave, not a dumping ground. This was something else, a circuit, a ring, a design passed down through generations and perfected by Hiram alone. He moved slowly that night, feet bare, linen robe tied at the waist with rope taken from the cellar. He carried the final body on a stretcher built from orchard branches, each one sanded and sealed in wax. The corpse was wrapped in white cloth, stitched shut with the care of a priest preparing a relic. The eyes were sewn open with thin strands of horsehair soaked in ash water, a detail taken directly from the plague doctor's journal. It was not for cruelty. It was for a purpose. Hiram believed that the dead, when buried properly, could become watchers, not spirits, not lost souls, but guardians, sentinels bound to the land by suffering and silence. The horsehair threaded through the lids and pulled tight ensured that their last gaze would remain fixed forever, facing upward, watching the sky, watching him. He placed the body gently into the final grave, laying a smooth river stone over the chest, then whispered a phrase in broken Latin, words he had repeated for each of them. Not a blessing, a command. In the dark, the other graves seemed to pulse beneath the ground, their outlines just visible beneath the pale light. Some were marked by small piles of clay, others by wooden tokens carved into symbols that had no meaning to anyone but him. He walked a slow circle around all of them, fingers trailing over the dirt, humming a low, tuneless sound he believed calmed the soil. To Hiram, this was not the end of killing. It was the beginning of protection. The farm had become something holy, not in the way of churches or scripture, but in the old way, in the way blood once made altars sacred. Every inch of the Bell land had absorbed something that no storm could wash away. Pain layered into the roots, into the stones, into the walls of the crooked house itself. He believed that now, with all 22 buried, the land would no longer be just a place. It would be a barrier, a shield. The orchard, fed by their remains, would grow stronger. The air would stay still. The animals would remain distant. No one would dare trespass. He had turned horror into harmony. He stood over the final grave until the moon dipped low, then pressed his hand into the dirt, palm flat, eyes shut. He said nothing aloud. He didn't need to. He felt the quiet in his bones, the same quiet he had chased in every scream, every stitch, every drop of blood boiled from the skin. It is complete now. The watchers were in place, their eyes open, their bodies still. They would never rot, not here, not under his watch. And if one day someone came looking, if someone dug too deep or asked the wrong questions, they wouldn't find bones, they'd find warning. They'd feel the pressure in the air, the way sound disappears too quickly, the way breath catches at the edge of the orchard. The land would speak, and if it didn't, the watchers would. In the spring of 1851, Hiram Bell died without warning. No sickness, no struggle. He collapsed alone at the edge of his orchard, his face turned to the sky, arms at his sides, eyes wide open as if watching something that no one else could see. The townspeople who found him said he looked peaceful, but not in the way good men do. It was the kind of stillness that came after a task had been finished, after something heavy had been buried. With no family left and no priest willing to speak over the Bell name, his body was placed in a pine box and lowered into a grave dug hastily behind the crooked house. No headstone, no scripture, just a few shovels of dirt and a handful of silence. Most were eager to leave the land behind, to forget the name they had whispered only when necessary. But the house had other plans. 3 days after his burial, a local carpenter sent to board up the windows found a loose floorboard beneath the parlor chair where Hiram often sat. It groaned when stepped on, then gave way, revealing a shallow compartment packed with linen. Inside was a single object, a folded letter sealed in red wax and bound with twine. The paper was thick, brittle around the edges and marked with a strange symbol pressed into the seal. 4 circles inside a square, each corner marked with a Latin phrase. The carpenter handed it to the sheriff without opening it, his hands shaking too badly to explain why. The letter was taken to the courthouse and read aloud behind closed doors. It should have never been read at all. The writing inside was clean, sharp, and disturbingly calm. Hiram had titled it, "The Record of My Seeing." It began with a list, 22 entries, each marked only by a symbol and a number. There were no names. Instead, each entry described the reason that person had been chosen. Not for revenge, not by accident, but for study. One had lied to a grieving mother. One had buried a child in secret. One had harmed animals without guilt. Hiram had selected each with care, claiming their pain would burn pure. For every victim he detailed the method used, some slow, some fast, some involving chemicals he had made from plant rot and bone ash. One entry described removing the inner ear bone and observing how long balance remained. Another explained a method of cutting the skin along the ribs in curved patterns, mimicking the spiral shells of sea creatures found in his journal. Each procedure was followed by a final paragraph, his observation of their last gaze. That was the heart of the letter, his claim that in their last seconds, just before death took them, something passed across their eyes. Don't panic, not pain. Something he called the veil, a flicker of awareness, a final knowing. He wrote that in those moments the eyes seemed to reflect something else. A place, a shadow that didn't belong to the room. He described it as a pulling, a silent recognition that the dying saw something just past the edge of life, something waiting, something vast and unfinished. He said the older ones fought it while the young surrendered quickly. He believed this veil held the truth about the soul, and that only through pain could it be fully seen. He ended the letter with a single line, "None of them died alone. I was there, and I saw what they saw. I am not afraid." The sheriff burned the letter the next morning. No copies were made, no records kept. But the courthouse clerk who had sat in the room when it was read was never the same. He resigned weeks later, refusing to speak of what he'd heard. Others who handled the letter reported strange dreams, visions of open eyes staring through earth, of voices speaking from the mouths of trees. Some said the orchard grew darker that year, the apples softer, redder, too heavy for the branches to hold. What the letter revealed was not just a confession, it was an invitation. A written doorway into a mind that had treated agony like scripture, that believed pain could peel away the human mask and show what waited behind it. And now that Hiram was dead, no one knew if the veil had opened for him, or if he had gone through it before death ever came. When the letter was finally read, the room stayed quiet for a long time. The sheriff, his hands stained with tobacco and years of rough justice, folded the parchment and stared at the seal one last time before tossing it into the courthouse stove. He said no jury in Tennessee was fit to carry what that letter contained. No court could touch what had already taken root in that land. The flames swallowed the paper without a sound, but its weight hung over the town like smoke that wouldn't clear. They all agreed, without saying it aloud, that some truths weren't meant for daylight, that some names were better buried than remembered. Quietly, over the next few months, state men arrived in unmarked wagons. They came at dusk, left before dawn. The orchard was cordoned off under the excuse of soil testing. Teams with gloves and lanterns unearthed what the town had pretended not to suspect. 22 bodies, some wrapped in rotted linen, others curled tight like children trying to hide. None were whole. Each had been arranged, altered, marked by some method that no one wanted to understand. The bones were loaded into crates marked with numbers instead of names, driven away under canvas sheets and never seen again. No funerals, no announcements, just silence. The ground was flattened, reseeded, and eventually sold to a cattleman who was told only that the land had good drainage. Not a single obituary was written, No charges were filed. The state declared the case closed due to lack of living suspects. But it wasn't about law. It was about fear. The people who'd read that letter, who'd seen what had been done to those bodies, knew something deeper than justice had been at work. Something older than the courts, stronger than morality. They didn't want answers, they wanted it gone. Gone from memory, gone from record, gone from anything that could bring it back. What Hiram Bell had done didn't just stain the soil, it changed how people walked past certain homes, how they handled old books, how they spoke to their own children at night. And maybe, worst of all, it taught them how to forget. In the summer of 1976, when Tennessee Power began clearing the far edge of Hollow Hill to run new transmission lines, the machines met something the blueprints hadn't warned them about. Not bedrock, not old tree roots, something softer but far more resistant. When the crew's backhoe caught the edge of it, the soil tore open like paper, revealing a line of linen-wrapped remains resting just beneath the surface, still curled, still facing upward, eyes long decayed but eerily wide open. Work stopped immediately. The site was closed off with yellow tape, and the word archaeological was used like a shield. But within days, the local whispers began to churn again, like old breath rising from under the earth. Some remembered stories, others had only heard fragments. The orchard, the silence, the man with no gravestone. One worker claimed his boots were pulled into the ground like it wanted to hold him. Another quit on the spot after saying he heard crying that didn't sound like wind. The site was surveyed by state officials, who quickly deemed it historically significant and halted development indefinitely. The land was fenced off and given to the county. No excavation followed, no deeper questions asked. But later that fall, a group of local historians, acting quietly and without ceremony, placed 22 plain white crosses at the edge of the property, just outside the fence line. They didn't mark the exact burial spots. They didn't label names or dates, just 22 silent markers facing the orchard, planted in a neat line like watchers looking in. A memorial, some said. A warning, others whispered. No one claimed responsibility, no dedication plaque, no newspaper announcement. It simply appeared. And since then, people passing through the area have reported the same thing. The orchard is still there, though most of the trees are dead now. But on certain nights, especially when the wind is low and the moon is full, the air along the fence turns cold. Visitors say it feels wrong to speak above a whisper. That footsteps sound muffled there like walking through wool. Some claim to hear weeping, not loud, not frantic, but steady and rhythmic like mourning stretched out across time. Others have described hearing breaths from behind, only to turn and find no one there. The white crosses are still clean, still upright, untouched by time or weather. And though no names are carved into them, people understand what they are. They are not graves. They are echoes, a visual reminder that the land never gave up the truth. It only swallowed it long enough to make people forget. The name Hiram Bell no longer appears in the state archives of Tennessee. No birth certificate. No property deeds. No death notice. The Bell farmhouse was left out of land surveys starting in 1902. The year county lines were redrawn and the records office suffered a fire that destroyed hundreds of documents. Though curiously, only those tied to properties east of Red River. His school attendance logs are missing. His family cemetery is unmarked. And though 22 crosses stand at the edge of Hollow Hill today, no one is taught why. Teachers skip that page. Local books mention the orchard only in passing, and when they do, it is framed as myth. The crooked house is never named. Children are told it's dangerous land, soft earth. A place where things go missing, that's all. On the surface, it looks like the story died when he did. But Hiram Bell understood something that most men never grasp. He knew that to keep something alive, you don't shout it into the world. You bury it carefully and you wait. Long before he collapsed alone in that orchard, long before his bones went into the ground and his secrets into ash, Hiram understood that method survives where memory fails. And it was the method he left behind. Not in journals or letters, not in relics or tools, but in the process. In the careful way he studied the mechanics of pain, the order with which he broke people down. That structure, what he called the shape of suffering, was not simply madness. It was a blueprint. He never believed himself to be a killer. He believed he was an observer, recording the moment when a human soul reached its final limit. And once he began to see patterns in that process, he refined it. I measured it, timed it, and eventually he believed he had mapped something bigger than pain itself, something that lived beyond it. In his ledger, now lost, he described the soul as a slow collapse of noise into silence. He believed that every person passed through the same invisible threshold during death. The same flicker behind the eyes, the same moment when breath no longer fed the body but fed something else. He thought this transition could be sharpened, made clearer by creating the perfect environment for it. Controlled agony, focused despair, not chaos, not rage, something cleaner, more clinical. He believed that only then, only at the exact moment when the body stopped resisting, could the true self be seen. And that sight, that final expression, became the sacred thing he chased. The work was never about death. It was about seeing. This idea didn't vanish with him. It was picked up in fragments by others, passed along without attribution through shared observations and translated notes. During the war between the states, a Union medic reported treating a Confederate prisoner who'd been kept awake for 10 straight days under candlelight, eyes held open by thread. The man had gone blind but claimed to see faces in the air. No one linked it to anything. In 1918, a mental institution in Kentucky was closed after patients were found arranged in ritualistic postures. Their mouths fixed open with wooden clamps, each one facing a mirror. The lead doctor had once studied under a professor who kept a collection of anonymous pain charts filed by shape rather than name. In 1942, a U.S. intelligence project known as Signal Blue tested sensory deprivation and forced silence on captured agents. A handwritten note in the corner of one report read, "Don't forget Bell's principle. Agony must observe itself." It was underlined twice. Today, no one says his name in training rooms, but traces of his beliefs are still there. Certain manuals reference emotional disassembly, breaking a subject not with force but with silence. Some methods mirror the exact sequence of stressors Hiram described in his own rituals. Light, then cold, then stillness. There are interrogation programs that speak of starting points where eye contact is held beyond comfort, beyond pain, into a place where the subject begins to see themselves from the outside. These aren't accidents. These aren't innovations. They are echoes. We live in a time that praises data, patterns, control. And in that hunger for results, Hiram's logic thrives. His methods, disguised now in scientific language, coated in bureaucratic polish, live on not because people are evil, but because people crave order. He provided that order in its darkest form, a system of suffering where nothing was random, where every broken cry could be charted, every failing breath turned into meaning. It's the kind of thinking that institutions adore, clean, quiet, useful. But the silence Hiram left behind wasn't empty. It watches. In every place where cruelty is treated as a tool, in every system that calls torment an experiment, in every room where a human being is broken down by hands wearing gloves and faces behind glass. It watches from those white crosses, from the orchard that still refuses to bloom, from the faces in the clay that even when shattered seem to remember how to scream. Some truths never die. They're buried, cultivated, and eventually they rise. Final reflection. In 1994, Tennessee passed the Unmarked Grave Protection Act. The law was pushed forward by a state senator whose grandfather had worked near Hollow Hill in the 1930s and claimed to have found more bones than he could count. No official connection was ever made. No names were entered into the state's memorial record. But at the edge of the orchard, the 22 crosses still stand. No plaque, no explanation. Just silence. Evil doesn't always wear a face. Sometimes it wears a procedure, it speaks in charts. I study quietly, and it waits for a world that prefers forgetting over remembering. So we ask you in the stillness of this moment, what do you think? Could this happen again? Behind closed doors? Inside systems we trust? Where silence is policy? And cruelty wears a lab coat? Let us know. And remember, not all graves are marked.